Hello and welcome to today's session. Today we're here to talk about how IT teams need a break, specifically automating the edge. And a lot of organizations are looking to reduce costs and data complexity, basically by using their existing teams and using automation to do that. So organizations are consistently battling with demands of growth and doing more with less. In fact, what we're seeing with our enterprise strategy group research, 53% of survey respondents indicated that IT environments are either more complex or significantly more complex than it was just 2 years ago. So something has to give, right? And organizations have to achieve their business KPIs. And by reducing cost and complexity, but leveraging your existing teams is possibly a way to do that. And that might be the answer. And by leveraging automation to achieve these tasks may overcome these IT skill gap issues, as well as accelerate the use of cloud adoption as well. So in this webinar today, we're here to cover a number of topics. We'll talk about managing the IT skill gap on-prem and using zero-touch provisioning. We're going to talk about how AIops and the Hypercore framework can provide observability and auto-provisioning and prevent future failures, potentially prevent those failures, and accelerate cloud adoption or any other resources outside the primary data center. But before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Paul Nashawati. I'm a principal analyst at Enterprise Strategy Group, a division of TechTarget, and I cover application infrastructure modernization. And I'm joined today by Craig from Scale Computing. Craig, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure thing, Paul. Thanks for having me on today. I'm Craig Tiriac. I'm the Vice President of Product Management at Scale Computing. I've been with the company for about 13 years now. Scale Computing, if you haven't heard of us, we are a leader in the edge computing infrastructure space. Our flagship product is kind of a combination, actually, of two different pieces. One is we call Hypercore, which is what you just referenced a second ago, which is kind of the operating system that runs on premises. And then we have what we call Fleet Manager, which gives observability and kind of management and orchestration across all of your fleet of clusters out there in the field. And really combined, you can kind of think of our platform as, again, Scale Computing Platform. It basically allows you to run workloads on premises with maximum uptime and minimizing the operational overhead that you have to deal with, IT infrastructure on-prem.
Awesome. Thanks, Craig. And, there's a lot here to unpack in this session. So let's just jump right in and get started. But before we do, I do want to give you a little bit of background, give the audience a little bit of background on who we are and where the data comes from. So we're going to talk about a number of different data points and a number of different sets of research. But I figured it would be important for the audience to understand where that research comes from. So Enterprise Strategy Group, if you're not familiar with us, we're an analyst research and validation firm that works with our clients on their strategy and utilizes research that's global, understanding global markets across different verticals and industries, and understanding the pain points and challenges those organizations run into. So the information that we're planning on sharing in this presentation comes from this research that we gather across these different challenges in those organizations across the world. So with that, I'd like to jump right into it. So Craig, there's a lot here, right? We talked about this in the opening. We talked about the skill gap issue. We talked about the lack of IT on-prem and utilizing zero-touch provisioning, right? We also see that using AIops and within the framework of Hypercore, it really can help with providing that observability, the actionable insights, providing auto provisioning and proactive, ways to prevent future failures. And then also look at the cloud, right? How to make that ease of use and look at anything that may be located outside the core data center. Look at that from the perspective of an edge location, right? But there's a lot here. But Craig, what are your thoughts here? Anything you want to add before we jump in?
No, I'm excited to jump in. It's a lot of hot topics here.
Excellent. Let's just get going here. So it's managing the skill gap, right? When we look at the first part of this webinar, we're looking at managing the skill gap, right? And we see that the growth and complexity is continuing to happen across organizations, right? Whether it's inside the core data center, outside the core data center, so the edge locations, we really recognize that the edge and anything outside the core data center is really growing. The core data center is really not growing, right? So the infrastructure is moving to an alternative, smaller locations. But let's look at the data that shows this, right? So when we look at the data here, right, we see that in this Enterprise Strategy Group study, that there's a significant growth of edge locations over the next 2 years, right? We see that 30% of respondents indicated that their organizations would have 500 to 1,000 edge locations over the next 2 years. So significant growth here. And with this growth, we potentially can see latency, compliance issue, cost factors where organizations are challenged at the edge, right? And combining that with limited or potentially even no IT staff, physical constraints may tie connectivity and outages and all lead up to unpredictable demands. So the edge locations or growth is on the rise. Core data centers are really not growing as fast. And then the infrastructure is moving to alternate smaller locations. Craig, what are your thoughts here?
First thing I think of is just kind of the drivers behind edge computing. What's causing these companies to want to put infrastructure out on premises? You just think of the cloud and how easy it is to use and the elasticity that it provides. And, IT teams and application teams that need to spin up workloads, you can do that really quickly with the cloud. If you decide to run on premises, you're giving up a lot of at least historically, giving up a lot of the easy use that you have with the cloud, and you're being met with some real challenges, right? So lack of IT personnel, which we're covering part of the skills gap, is one of them. But it's other things like physical security and, regulation you've got to deal with, and just things that you don't necessarily have to think of when you're deploying to the cloud. And so the drivers here of why people are even running on premises are probably something to do with latency, right? Some new workload that's AI, machine learning, computer vision, maybe, where they're required to run on premises, or could be throughput that's driving this need, where they're just generating so much data that actually putting that in the cloud is either cost prohibitive or just physically impossible, depending on how much data they're creating. It could be regulation, right? So it could be that they're in an industry that is regulated, that's requiring that data to not leave, and that could be the site, that could be a jurisdiction, it could be really anything. It depends on what the application is, the data is. Personally identifiable information is one of those things that I always see come up, that somebody says, I got to run this on premises because we know who this person is and we cannot put that out on public cloud resources. And then behind that, we also see that there's still locations out there that have a lot of connectivity issues, right? So you decide you want to run something on premises just for the fact that you may not always have a connectivity to the internet that you can rely on. And then probably the last driver that I see, which isn't talked about as much, is you kind of think of it as refactoring cost. You want to make use of the cloud resources, but that application that you've had there for the last 10 years, all the expertise you had to maintain that application is gone. And so you basically have to keep this either as a physical machine or as a virtual machine running on infrastructure on premises, and refactoring that code, just the cost to do that is insurmountable. And so it doesn't make sense necessarily to run in the cloud as a result. And so that's what I'm seeing as a driver for a lot of these. So whatever category you fall into, I'm guessing one of those hits home as to why it is that you might be looking to expand out to your different locations.
Yeah, great points there, Craig. Great. When we look at, all of that touches, we have data sets that kind of back up every one of those points, right? Whether it's compliance or regulations or GDPR or refactoring or whatever it may be, performance issues, there's always a reason to kind of look into alternate locations, alternate solutions. But, I do want to double click down a little bit on that IT skill gap issue, because, when we look at these edge locations, a lot of times organizations just don't have the resources, the people resources to have, running in these locations, right? So when we look at the IT skill gap, right, we see that, when we look at edge locations, we look at areas that can be, addressed by technology, right? When we look at the overall process around organizations, you have that people, process, and technology, those three-legged stool on how to run the business, right? And when we're looking at what we're seeing on this slide, 30% of respondents indicated that IT operations was a significant gap with IT and with skills. But Craig, you talked a little bit about fleet manager and zero touch provisioning. That seems to be a good way, or potentially a good way, to overcome some of these challenges. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the challenges are significant without having IT resources on-prem. And what we see people do today is, if you're going to run something on-prem, you need to get something deployed out there. You either stage it, you bring it somewhere centrally, and you've got your IT expertise, and you've got your keyboard and video mouse and all your, your favorite coffee mug, and everything you need centrally to be able to do the staging of whatever infrastructure you need to put out on the location, and then you drive it out. Or you work with kind of an integrator who specializes in being your feet on the street. And as any of you know who have done this before, that gets really expensive. So zero-touch provisioning, as you mentioned, is a feature of our platform that essentially allows you to stage everything without having to have IT expertise on-prem. Think of a retailer as an example, right? So you've got 1,000 locations, probably the most experienced IT person you have on staff, maybe the youngest person that you've hired there. It's probably not even the store manager. And you're not going to ask that person or the store manager necessarily to be in charge of the infrastructure. Now, you may say, I trust that person to plug in power and networking, but not necessarily to type in an IP address or, some other piece of information that, if misconfigured, could cause a lot of issue. And so what zero-touch provision allows our users to do is to stage these clusters so that as soon as they ship from our integrator, they go directly to whatever site that the customer wants to deploy that out. And we still have some customers that are still staging as a result of this. But even with, if you skip that stage and go directly to the end user, that store manager can plug in the power, can plug in the networking, and then it reaches out securely to our Fleet Manager product and says, hey, I'm online. Can I have my configuration file? And it's securely sent down, and it just sets itself up. So, talk about a skill gap. You can think of it in two different ways. You can think of it, one, in terms of, physically not having IT resources on-prem. It's not that you're looking for IT resources on-prem. You would never hire somebody in that IT or in that retail environment that I just gave as an example. You'd never hire somebody that would say, just sit at the store all the time waiting for the IT infrastructure and dealing with that. And so it's a lack of IT resources on-prem to deal with the physical infrastructure. And then you also look at the automation behind that, for the lack of IT resources, the skill gap that you have centrally to be able to interact with this. And so being able to automate the setup, as well as, right behind zero-touch provisioning, we have, we've got a lot of tools out there that allow you to interact with the cluster as code. Most recent being release of Red Hat Ansible, kind of a certified collection that you can use to interact with the infrastructure as code. So it basically goes from unboxing, plugging in power, networking, get this cluster up and running. Then all of a sudden you start putting your workloads on there programmatically, kind of handing over the reins to your application teams to be able to empower them to really interact with that cluster. And it's just a seamless experience all around. We've seen, in fact, I did a video maybe 2-3 weeks ago with my son. My son's 8 years old, and I let him be the feet on the street. We pretended he was a store, and he went and he plugged everything in. And my son he's brilliant. He's a really smart guy, but he's not an IT admin. There's kind of a certain level of things I would let him do. Plug in power is one of them. That's about it. And that kind of goes hand in hand with, I think, how a lot of these companies have to treat these locations, especially if they're really distributed where they don't have IT resources.
Craig, you touched on a lot. It sounds like your son has a bright future ahead of him in the IT world. So that's really great. I will add to that a little bit. I was at a CIO summit a couple of weeks back, and I was asking, the attendees there, they're asking about what their pain points were, what their challenges were, right? What are they experiencing? And they're getting a tremendous amount of pressure from their boards, from their corporations, from their organizations to modernize, right? To move forward and modernize. And you're spot on. I mean, the challenge that they hit was, well, we're running down the road, and with the resources we have, we're barely keeping the wheels on the bus, right? So there's just a lot happening there. So we can't add more resources there or more onto those resources. But if we hire people, it might take, 9 to 12 months before those people are productive. Well, that's really not an option, right? So an alternative is to work with a service delivery partner, right? But a service delivery partner can be expensive. So if you look at it from the perspective of what you were talking about, having that ability to have like a generalist almost do an install, and then having the infrastructure as code and the provisioning with zero-touch provisioning really lifts those burdens from the organizations that are trying to move forward with modernizing to adapt new ways of doing business and basically moving their organization into the future. So I hear the challenges from that CIO summit. It sounds like they align nicely to what you're talking about here, and it's a cost-effective way to automate the provisioning process of new deployments. Also, by automating, the other thing is once it's running, right, it's important to have actionable insights, right, and understand what's happening. So when we look at the next part of the presentation here, we're looking at how AIOps kind of works within the environment, right, and having the ability to have like the observability or the actionable insights to auto provision and proactively look at different areas so you see what's happening and you could make those changes before those any errors may occur in the future. That's important, right? So can you talk a little bit about this and what this means from a scale perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to the skill gap, right? It's this goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about. In fact, at that forum that you just went to, where they said, well, we could hire somebody that's going to take 9 months. That's if you can find somebody. I actually just read this astounding stat, and it was a prediction, so we all know how predictions are, but basically said that by 2030, 75% of IT openings would not be filled. You just think about that for a second. That means that you have a requirement, you've gotten approval to hire somebody to actually fill that gap, and you can't find the person to do it. And what that means is that you all of a sudden you go from a situation today where you struggle maybe to get approval to hire the person, and then to hire them, and then it takes 9 months to get them ramped up. Where having automation and AI ops, just to give a little bit of background, it's just artificial intelligence for IT operations. This whole concept is to use AI to be able to augment what it is that your teams can do. It goes from today being kind of a nice to have to, in next 12, 24 months and beyond, that it becomes an absolute requirement that you have to have infrastructure that can kind of manage itself. And so you can think of it in two different ways. One is with AI ops. I mean, there are a whole slew of products. I won't even name one out there that pull in information from a bunch of disparate areas and kind of cross domain and can kind of propagate up things that are important and look for false positives and basically help you manage that infrastructure. But what we've done at Scale Computing is we built in AIOps functionality just directly into our domain of expertise, and we understand kind of within the framework of our infrastructure what has to happen, and we call that AIM. It's Autonomous Infrastructure Management Engine. So that lives within Hypercore, which is the software that runs on premises, and this is what allows you to run without having to really care and feed for the infrastructure. And so we've got a lot of customers out there and say in seagoing vessels where they're going to put this thing on a ship. And I can tell you that not only is there no IT expertise on the ship, it's going to take a while before they can get somebody to port to even deal with this stuff. And so it just has to stay up and operational. And so when I was talking about earlier, minimizing operational overhead, this part of this is giving observability so that you can see here's what's going on in the environment. But it also says you have to have some local intelligence to be able to act on drive failures and node failures and all the things that can physically happen in this environment that is not a tier 1 data center.
Yeah, Craig, absolutely. And in our data that we have that kind of aligns that as well is really it's the point you were talking about when you look at the IT skill gap, right? With the skill gap in general, but it's also other areas, right? Like if you look at, you were talking about if there's a failure, what about backups? What about protection from malware? What about protection from just anything that happens? But also operational efficiencies, regardless of the macroeconomic conditions out there. Organizations are always looking to be optimized, and they're always looking at operational efficiencies as a priority. This is, we've seen this in good and bad times, right? So organizations are looking at that, and having that actionable insight is important from the view perspective of understanding what's happening. So, I couldn't agree more with how you positioned it. Especially when you're looking at those different use cases, basically offshore or transportation or areas that maybe you're not connected. You really have to deal with this effectively and efficiently in order for your business to run streamlined, right? So important kind of insights here is key. It's important for the audience here to understand that these are just a few points to consider, but for your own business, think about how AIOps can work for your organization and how it would impact your environment. So Craig, next I want to pivot to the cloud. I mean, everybody talks about the cloud, right? Everyone talks about how, the cloud is important. And, we see that, right? We've had a great discussion so far on the edge. But we also need to look at, speed and rapid time to value, right? And when we understand these challenges, you touched on this earlier when we were talking about the cloud, like when we're looking at hybrid cloud deployment and processing from information. It really does come down to like how it all works in location, right? So when we ask respondents about the organizations using hybrid clouds and delivery in their production applications, we saw that 46% of respondents indicated that their organizations have deployed multiple production applications in a hybrid cloud model. And 31% indicate that they deploy a single production application in a hybrid cloud model. So the point here is there's a lot of use of multi-cloud, distributed cloud environments. And when we say cloud, it's really about location, right? So anything outside the primary data center, what that means to different, to organizations is different, but we're really talking about that, basically that rapid time to value, right? And speed for that. So what are your thoughts here, Craig?
Well, I think people get wrapped up sometimes on definitions for sure, but I think that most people. Here's how I like to think of the cloud versus edge, and we can talk about where scale computing plays in this. But if you think about it, you've got cloud or kind of primary core data center on one end, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have these kind of almost gateway devices, like the farthest thing possible, the closest thing really to the people and things that are interacting with it. And you can have computing infrastructure pretty much anywhere on this entire spectrum, all the way from that far edge, all the way back to that core data center. And I think the important thing for application teams and for IT teams they're dealing with this infrastructure to think about is it doesn't matter really where that infrastructure is run, whether you own it or not. Like in the case of a cloud where you're just renting effectively services to be able to run this application. It really comes down to what are the attributes of the workloads you need to run, and what are the requirements for those workloads, right? I mean, if it requires low latency, that may be on one side. If it requires high uptime, that may be somewhere else. If it requires a certain cost, that may be somewhere else. And you basically just have to look at those workloads, figure out what the requirements are for them, and then be able to place that somewhere. And our whole thing at Scale Computing is to kind of think of it as the easy button for running something on premises. If you decide that for whatever reason, there's something about the cloud, and I mean core data center or cloud, that doesn't necessarily fit one of your workloads, where you say, I actually have to run this closer to those people and things somewhere along that spectrum, here's the easy button that allows you to say, I don't necessarily want to burden my IT team with having to manage this infrastructure. You want to just be able to place that out there and kind of hand over the keys to the application teams to be able to deploy on there, or have your teams deploy the workloads directly onto there, not have to necessarily worry about the underlying infrastructure, if that makes sense.
Completely makes sense. And what we're seeing in our research, we're seeing that platform engineering, DevOps teams, SREs, they're really getting more and more involved and get in the point of putting the applications where they need to reside. Right. And it could be various locations and such. But what we see in our research, we actually see that, 88% of production workloads are running in some type of cloud. Now, when we say cloud, Craig, I want to kind of echo what you were talking about a little bit. It doesn't necessarily mean a public cloud or a specific, it could be a cloud like environment. Right. But when we look at the right side of this slide, we see that 89% of respondents are running on two or more types of cloud. So distributed cloud environments. But to your point, Craig, there's a lot of different ways to deploy, right? A lot of different ways and a lot of reasons to deploy, right? But application modernization often comes down to modernizing to a cloud-like infrastructure, right? Or a cloud-like deployment. So if you're running in a public cloud or a private cloud or a hybrid cloud or whatever it may be, or if you need to run in a on-site location, you're still running a cloud-like environment, right? So those applications are not going to change, right? They're going to run however they're going to run, but they're going to run in a cloud-like environment. So cloud native is that approach. So typically I have this conversation about that application journey, right? We start with, at least I like to frame it up like this. I say that you start with about 5 phases, right? And any organization can have any application in any one of these phases. So you have your traditional or heritage applications. Then those maybe get encapsulated into a VM. And then from there, they may get moved into a fat container for orchestration. And then from there, they may start using microservices and then move to a fully elastic environment. All that said, the underlying architecture, the infrastructure that makes it work should be transparent to those applications in that journey. So you're optimizing the infrastructure based on your business needs. So that's really a powerful statement, because when you can do the self-provisioning and you can provide platform engineering teams with the way to turn things on and turn things off appropriately, that is a modern business approach, right? So when you think about this, most businesses now, release cadences are not like they were just a few years ago. We see organizations that are releasing code multiple times a day, a very frequent or multiple, hourly releases of code. That has to be done with a modernized infrastructure. So, Craig, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I think you nailed it with the transparency, right? That spectrum that I was talking about, from cloud to out to the far edge. I can tell you that the teams that are deploying that don't want to have to care about where it is. All they care is that are the service levels that they need for their workloads being met. If so, great. They just want to be able to interact with it, in that way, and then send out their applications. And if that's multiple times a day, no problem.
Absolutely. No, that's a real business challenge that we're seeing today. So for the audience, think about it in your own situation. What is going to work best for you, right? What is going to work best for your environment? And then I want to put this slide back up, Craig, because this is a slide that, if we think about the growth outside the data center, right, there's a significant amount of growth, right? You look at that right side of the slide, and 500 to 1,000 locations, or more than 1,000 locations, that's 38% of the respondents are saying that in the next 2 years, they're going to have, a 500 to over 1,000 locations of distributed environments. How is and this is a question to the audience, how is your current IT staff going to manage that? And how are you going to do that, without, maybe if you're not using automation today, how are you going to do it without automation? How are you going to do it without resources at each one of those locations? It's unrealistic to think that you'll have more than 1,000 locations and have a body at each location. That's really a stretch goal, I would think. But Craig, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've got several. So let me start by saying this whole edge compute market is pretty nascent, right? I mean, I think we're just seeing the outset of this right now, and a lot of the applications that are expected over the next few years that are just going to drive this growth, and kind of why you're seeing this massive jump for the 501 locations and beyond, is it's some of the kind of AI, machine learning, computer vision workloads. In retail, that's probably like QDepth. They're analyzing customer patterns. And manufacturing, it could be predictive maintenance and safety and security. Or in healthcare, it's kind of improving patient outcome type of workloads. And I will say that the infrastructure teams that I talk to, often, there are a handful of them that say, I know the application that I'm planning to run, here's what I want to do, and I need to roll this out, and let's test just this one application. But oftentimes what I'm hearing is, I have a legacy application that I've had out there for the last 10 to 15 years, and that thing needs to keep running. The infrastructure it's running on is coming up for whatever reason. It's about to fall apart. I need to replace the infrastructure. But I know this thing is looming. I know that I have edge computing needs that are coming very soon. They're going to have to sit right beside this legacy application that I'm going to have to run on premises. What can I do to future-proof my infrastructure to take advantage of that? And I would say every enterprise customer that we talk to, they go through a series of steps when they engage with us. First have a conversation. We show them the platform. We talk about how it works. And of course, we show off zero-touch provisioning, some of these cool features that really stand out in the market. And the very next step is that they bring in a proof of concept, and it may be us versus a handful of other options out there, or could just be us. And during that piece, they're just beating up the infrastructure. It's physically unplugging cables and turning off nodes and trying to mimic any failure scenario they possibly can. They're testing zero touch provision to say it's as seamless as we say it is. They're trying to validate that their applications are going to run on this platform, and it's daunting, but they make it through that pretty quick. And then they go on, they kind of graduate and say, okay, I've met all the requirements of the POC. Let's go on to a pilot phase. And in that pilot phase, it's usually, a handful of locations. Pick 5 locations, maybe the worst offenders. Let's try them out here first, low risk and real world applications running on here. Let's see if this works. And once we graduate from that, then it goes on to potentially a bigger pilot, or just full on, the race is on, let's get everything deployed across all of my entire fleet, all the locations. And so that path that these enterprises go on, we've got thousands of customers that have been with scale computing for years now, and we have seen this pattern emerge, as we engage with enterprise customers. And just rest assured, as daunting as everything I just described sounds, we're here as a partner to kind of help through that and really help do the crawl, walk, run approach that I think everybody appreciates in here. And when it's time to run, we're ready to run really fast.
Craig, I was just thinking the same exact statement when you were talking. I'm thinking that's a really powerful approach, that you can have a crawl, walk, run approach. And the other thing that we see a lot in our research is organizations are looking to reduce the complexity and looking to vendors to help, streamline and reduce and provide that ease of use solution, right? And you just nailed it, right? You just said that, you're there to help the organization through their journey, and that's important. But, Craig, we're coming up towards the end of our session here. And just for the audience perspective, we have a lot to kind of go through here. We went through it in a short amount of time, but we covered the IT skill gap issue. We covered the AIops piece where it allows for that observability and auto provisioning. And we covered the cloud. And we just had a real kind of tip of the iceberg approach to this. But Craig, I'd like to turn it over to you to see if you have any final words you'd like to leave with the audience.
Which is kind of building on what I was just saying with the, we're here to work as a partner with you as you go to take on this daunting challenge of deploying edge infrastructure out there at all your locations, which is that we have what we call our edge computing trial. It's linked here on this slide as kind of a call to action, is to click through on that and fill out the form. We would love to get infrastructure in your hands so you can test this out, because it's one thing to say that the product is easy to use. It's one thing to say that zero touch provisioning is, as the fastest thing in the market, 90% time savings and all this stuff. But until you actually feel it and see it and start the proof of concept, it's all us saying these things and not proving it. So I would welcome anybody to click through on that, and let's start down the journey of deployment.
Craig, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been really an interesting conversation. I really enjoy having these discussions with you. It really is powerful, and I hope the audience really got a lot out of it. I do want to thank the audience for attending today. There's a lot here to go through. I encourage you to look at the attachment section here and see access any of the resources available to you and continue the conversation. Thank you and have a great day.